panel this morning, Changing Climate, Changing Forests, and the Legal Landscape. This morning, Professor Jack Tucholsky will be moderating. He's a visiting professor here at the University of Montana School of Law. We have four great panelists. Jessica Owley is an associate professor at the University at Buffalo School of Law. Elizabeth Cronk is an assistant professor at Texas Tech University School of Law. Eric Biber is an assistant professor at Berkeley Law. And Diana Six is a professor of forest entomology and pathology here at the University of Montana.
Good morning and welcome to the final session of the Public Land Law Conference. This certainly has been an outstanding gathering. I think there's been some wonderful exchanges, and we're going to have some more here this morning. Before we start with the panelists, I just want to share with you something that I read. It was on MSNBC News. So, of course, it has to be true. And it was a report September 1st, 2001, which explained that some scientists returned to the Petermann Glacier in Greenland and found a stunning retreat of that glacier, including a 2010 calving event that set an ice island 112 square miles adrift in the North Atlantic. Enough water in that one island, which is an infinitesimally small fraction of the Greenland ice sheet, to keep the Hudson and Delaware rivers flowing for 2 years. And what really startled them was something they've labeled the Big Kahuna, which is a crack on this one particular glacier, one, of course, of dozens of glaciers in Greenland that feed into the ocean. And the Big Kahuna is going to go, and it's going to send an ice sheet the size of which they have never seen before into the Atlantic. So what does this matter? Well, you know, maybe Greenland is going, and maybe the thermohaline circulation system that drives much of the Earth's climate is going to get upset, and just maybe that might have a profound effect on Montana's climate. We don't know, and we are entering what Professor Rule from Florida called the no analog future. We haven't been here before, and so we don't know where we're going to go. And my point in bringing this up is to say that, in a sense, we are all joined at the hip on this planet when it comes to climate change. And so the discussions today from these panelists are going to range not only in Montana, but much farther afield. And I think it's appropriate when we think about Montana's forests and our public land and natural resources that we have to start thinking in a global context, because when you talk about climate change, folks, you have to talk globally. And so with that, I will turn the podium over to our first panelist. Professor?
Is there a way to turn down the lights a little bit on that? Or is that visible enough? Maybe that's okay. Okay, good morning. And I'm not going to speak about law this morning because I'm a biologist. So what I am going to talk about is a changing climate and what that may mean for our forests. So let me make sure I get this right. Good. When you talk to the public, a lot of times you get the perception that many people believe that climate change is real and that climate change is liable to have some pretty significant impacts. But you also get the perception, a lot of people think that climate change is one of those things that, you know, it's off there in the future, okay? It's not really happening now, so, you know, it's out there, you know, 50, 100 years away or something. And nothing could be less true, because we are seeing climate change already, and we're seeing some really big impacts, and I'm going to talk about some of those that we're already seeing out there in the forests all over the globe. One of the things we are seeing is loss of foundational species, and this is just as important as it sounds. Foundational species are those that really, for a particular ecosystem, modulate the processes and all the things that occur there. And so when you lose one of those, which in a forest is typically a particular tree species, everything changes. We're also seeing a lot of alterations of biological diversity, and of course that's not surprising because if you change the conditions, the environmental conditions in an area, that's going to affect the relative abundance of the organisms there. Excuse me. Some will go up in abundance, some will go down, and some will disappear, and we're already seeing these kinds of effects. Now, something a lot of people don't think about is what happens to interactions. I mean, a lot of the studies look at, are we losing this species? What's happening with that species? But what we're seeing really importantly is that some of the ecosystem glue, the interactions, is being affected. Okay, so some of those interactions are being altered and in some cases completely torn apart. We're seeing increased effects of pests. This is something I'm going to talk about more in a moment because that's what I work on. But also importantly, we're seeing emerging pests, things that never used to be a problem, all of a sudden becoming serious problems. We're also, because of all these things and more, seeing shifting ecosystem services and functions, and that brings everything home very much to us because those are the things we depend upon. And very seriously, we're also seeing on the extreme end things you can call biome shifts. And that's where an ecosystem completely changes state, hits a tipping point, and turns into something else. I want to start off talking about global tree die-offs. And these are happening as a globally. I guess I'm being redundant there. These are just some examples. Up top are giant euphorbia trees. This happens to be a system I work on in Africa. And it's a big succulent. These are actually small ones, but sort of like if you want to think of saguaros on major steroids. These are giant trees, and they're dropping dead across 3 or 4 countries there. It's a very serious problem, and it's happened just in the last 4 or 5 years. Down on the bottom here, you can see the pinyon die-off we saw across the southwest, and then over in the other corner, aspen decline. So these are just some examples. So what are tree die-offs? It's high proportions of particular tree species that die on the regional scale. So these are big scales. This is not just a little patch of the Bitterroot or something or part of Montana. We're talking big scales. They occur over just a few years, sometimes as little as 3 or 4, and they're typically tied to increased warming and drying. And most of the ones that we see now we think are related to climate change. And why is that? Because in the past we've actually seen quite a few tree die-offs, and we don't think they were related to it. But the thing is, the ones we're seeing now are much more extensive, they're much more damaging, and instead of a couple occurring, in one continent at a particular time, these are occurring simultaneously all around the planet. Craig Allen put out a really nice paper last year where he documented, using some very conservative criteria, 88 instances of tree die-offs that are occurring right now around the planet. And there's literally hundreds more that remain to be studied to see what they're tied to. Some are so severe that they'll actually lead to the actual or functional extinction of those tree species. Actual extinction is what we all think of when we hear the word extinction. Every last individual of that species is gone. But more often what we're going to see is functional extinction, which means that there's still a few left out there, but there's no longer enough of them to fulfill an ecological role, so they really might as well be gone. These things all feed back on each other. Here's a graphic from a really nice paper that Adams put out last year, and it shows how a lot of these things are all tied together. So here we have some of the changing drivers. We have increases in temperature. In most areas, we have a decrease in precipitation. Where we don't see decreases in precipitation quite often, we'll see increased interannual variability. And so you see years that are extremely wet, years that are extremely dry. And in the case of where you have lowered precipitation or this extreme variability, what that does is it causes an enormous amount of stress on your trees. And when you have stressed trees, they lose their defenses and they become incredibly available to insects, and you start having an increase in tree pests. So all of this then feeds over here to create these regional scale die-offs, but also, which are very spectacular when you see them, but also something more insidious and less apparent that appears to be going on. Philip Van Mantum put on, or published a really cool paper last year. He's been studying forests around the West and has seen that, the background mortality rate, which always goes on in forests, you always have some mortality, has more than doubled. And that's pretty serious implications for our forests because that doesn't mean necessarily sustainability. And so this all means with all this mortality, you have an increase in albedo, which is basically reflectance because of all the dead trees. And this is really good because reflectance means you're shooting some of that heat back out and it actually has a cooling effect. So all these dying trees are good for climate change. Just kidding. Actually, that gets totally swamped out by this problem because when you have a lot of dead trees, you're going to release a lot of carbon, okay? And either through decay or fires or whatever, and they're not going to act as sinks anymore. And so you have an increase in warming at the surface, and that, of course, feeds back to create more of this. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about insects and pathogens because they are some of the first responders we see to climate change. They are incredibly sensitive to the environment. They respond to very tiny changes and almost immediately. They change very quick, especially in response to temperature and availability in food. So for insects, basically, as things warm up, everything for an insect speeds up. Okay, their development rate, their reproduction rate, and for insects, many of them, for as little as 2-degree change, can double development and reproduction. Okay, so that's big changes in population size. Add to that the fact that when you have decreased precipitation or higher interannual variability, you have stressed trees that become more available as food. Now you have lots more insects, higher survival, easy food, and we see massive outbreaks begin to develop. Fire gets a lot of press, okay, because it's very flashy, but something a lot of people aren't aware of is that, in fact, insects and pathogens are the #1 disturbance agents in our forests. They actually affect areas 50 times greater than fire and 5 times more economic impact. So this is serious. And of course, they also interact with the #2 disturbance agent, fire. This is an example that I'd like to use to show how fast and how good insects are at responding in our forests. I'm going to use bark beetles as an example because they really are our best examples right now, and also this is the group I do my research on, so one I know about. This is a map. It's a little bit older, but it's still really impressive, I think. It shows distribution of 3 outbreaks of bark beetles. Green is spruce beetle, red is our friend mountain pine beetle, and blue is Pinyon Ips. The green one was an outbreak that occurred a while back. When it happened, especially up in Alaska where they lost 3 million acres, it was mind-blowing because it was the biggest known outbreak of a bark beetle ever to occur on this planet. It was driven by a 6-degree increase in temperatures there that allowed the insect to double its development rate and just go nuts. And it has altered that ecosystem probably forever. After that, we got an outbreak in the southwest of Pinyon Ips, and interestingly, this particular bark beetle had never been a pest before. In fact, 10 years ago, I couldn't even find the thing hardly. It goes into trees that are practically dead from stress, and these trees were so stressed from heat and drought that they were basically dying. In fact, a lot of them died before the beetles had time to get there. And this is extensive and some places 97% mortality and probably a permanent change there. Mountain pine beetle epidemic now, excuse me, is the biggest ever. It's 10 times bigger than any outbreak that has ever occurred before with mountain pine beetle, and obviously the biggest ever of any kind with any bark beetle. It also is different not only in its severity and extent, but the insect has now expanded its geographic range. It's now several hundred miles further north because it's now warm enough for it to be further north in British Columbia. This is an old map. It has moved further east. It has jumped the continental divide up there into an area where it has never been before. It's halfway across Alberta, where it has moved into jack pine, which is a tree it has never used before. It does excellent in Jack pine, and now it's predicted to move all the way across the continent and into the eastern pines, acting essentially as an exotic. So things are changing. Things are pretty different. Another way that the mountain pine beetle has changed is through climate changes. It's gone higher in elevation. This is another system I work in. This is whitebark pine. It's a foundational species for our subalpine ecosystems of the West. And because of warming, the insect can now go all the way to the tops of the mountains where it never used to really could go before, even in harsh, cold areas like Yellowstone and the Wind Rivers in Wyoming and so forth. The progression through the stands is about 3 years. It goes through 3 times faster than in lodgepole, probably because this tree doesn't have any defenses against the insect. Never needed them. The impact over the last few years has been so serious that it was proposed to list for the endangered species list. The ruling came back warranted but precluded. They think it deserves it, but they don't have the money to deal with it. So this is another serious impact. This is what it looks like all across the high elevations now of Yellowstone, the Tetons, the Wind Rivers. Total devastation of whitebark pine, and it probably will not come back. So it's what we think will be a biome shift. It will go to another ecosystem, whatever that is. So what does this mean for forest management and planning? It means we've got an amazing challenge ahead, and I'm not sure how we're ever going to even begin to deal with this. Restoration is no longer appropriate, obviously, because you can't force something back into historic conditions when the conditions that support those no longer exist. You can't really work towards resistance against climate change, because that is really like paddling upstream. Trying to force a forest to stay the same when conditions is changing is totally unsustainable. A short-term thing that will probably work to a degree, and especially to gain us some time till we learn more, is trying to improve resilience, which is, trying to build in the ability for that ecosystem to tolerate disturbance a little bit better so we can avoid some major shifts. But that's still a short-term type of a thing, because forests are going to continue to change as conditions change. So really what it's going to take is for us to enable forests to change and allow them to change. We don't know how to do this yet. So it's going to take a lot of new information. It means we're going to have to focus more on ecosystem process than what's there, the composition, and what the structure is, which is how we typically manage now. So these are real challenges, and it really means that we're going to have to do what we call real adaptive management. That term gets thrown around a lot. People say they're doing it a lot, but very seldom is that the case. For adaptive management, you have to have good, appropriate quality monitoring, and you have to have a very flexible approach where you can go in, learn from your mistakes, and be able to change. You can't do any of that unless you have good and appropriate monitoring. And we also have to realize that in many cases, we are not going to be able to do anything. There's a lot of this stuff we are not going to be able to manage our way out of. We're going to have to sit back, see what happens, consider some serious climate scenario planning, because if things go badly and we lose some services, we should kind of be able to predict that and know how we're going to be able to respond to that when it happens. So on that positive note, I'll end. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And we will have time, obviously, for some questions from the audience afterwards. Next up is Professor Elizabeth Cronk.
All right, good morning. Always a bit of a challenge to be on the 8:30 a.m. panel. But I am really pleased as punch to be here. One, because it's great to see some green after moving to Texas. But two, I am so incredibly proud of the students. And I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the students who are back here in the back of the room, I think, because they have just done a fantastic job of putting together a great panel with some phenomenal speakers. I'm really proud to be on the panel that I'm in. There are a lot of people on this panel that I really respect. I've also heard amazing things about your conference already, so thank you for inviting me. Thank you for putting on this conference. You're doing a great job, and I'm just so happy to be part of this, so thank you. That being said, I'm also really excited to be back in Montana. I just moved to Texas 2 months ago from Montana, so it's nice to be here and to talk to you about a topic that's near and dear to my heart. So what am I going to talk about today? I'm going to briefly talk about the problem of deforestation, and thankfully Dr. Six has done a phenomenal job, I'm so lucky to speak after her, of doing a great job of really encapsulating what is the problem. So we'll start off by talking briefly about what is the problem of deforestation. Then we'll talk about a potential legal remedy, and that legal remedy is REDS. So we'll talk more about what the REDS programs are and how they potentially could be a post-Kyoto international protocol tool that we can use as lawyers to help to begin to address this problem that, again, Dr. Six has done a great job of outlining for us today. Then we're going to talk about what I see as a potential problem with REDS, and something that we here in Montana in particular really need to be aware of, and that is climate justice concerns, specifically climate justice concerns that our indigenous populations may have. And why, may you ask, is this an issue that we should be aware of for Montana? And we'll get a little bit more into this later, but I think there's an interesting question of whether federally recognized tribal reservations, tribal nations, could potentially have CDMs, or clean development mechanisms, on their reservations through a post-Kyoto international treaty. So as you know, there's a lot of federally recognized land here in Montana. There's a lot of forest here in Montana. So this is potentially a tool that we need to be aware of, and that could have implications for us here in the state. All right, so the problem, and again, Dr. Six has done a far better job than I could ever do in really developing the problem. But deforestation, as she was pointing out, is the loss of forest. And the IPCC has said that it contributes to 1/5 of global greenhouse gas emissions. In its 2007 report, the IPCC found that approximately 20% of anthropogenic emissions came from the forestry industry, and that includes deforestation. And as Dr. Six did a great job, there's really a feedback loop here, that as we lose forests, we lose the ability to sequester carbon sequestration. She had that great feedback loop chart that she put up. And so as we are losing our ability to sequester carbon, we therefore are leading to increased climate change, which just starts the cycle all over again. So this has really important implications for our economy, for our global world, with the impact of forests. Also, as she pointed out, another big reason why obviously we should be concerned about this problem of global deforestation is that it leads to a loss of biodiversity. So there are a lot of problems here associated with deforestation. Definitely something that we need to be aware of. Definitely that's something that's really impacting us here in Montana and globally. So it's a concern. All right, so what is the law of climate change here, and in particular, what are REDS? So we're going to briefly talk about that. Very brief introduction to the International Law of Climate Change. You could trace this back to the 1992 Rio Protocol. However, we'll start with the UN Framework for Convention on Climate Change. That framework essentially was an international agreement that we should do something about climate change. It was a recognition that climate change was a threat to the world, and it was a recognition that the country should do something. So it was an aspirational document, recognizing the problem and recognizing a desire to address the problem. We then tried to start working towards that. And for purposes of this discussion, the Berlin Mandate was very important because it was a recognition that developing nations were not going to be held to emissions limitations. So it's only going to be Annex 1 or the developed world that is going to potentially have to deal with emissions limitations. So when we start to talk about REDS, or when we start to talk about deforestation or afforestation or reforestation topics, what we're talking about is the developed world, Annex 1 countries, coming into the developing world and doing projects there. So we're largely talking about forests that would be in the developing world. However, again, I think an interesting question is whether or not our federally recognized Indian nations could fall under that category 2 of Annex 2 nations or developing nations under what is now the Kyoto Protocol and possibly a post-Kyoto Protocol scheme. As you may know, many federal tribal nations are recognized by the United Nations as sovereign entities. So it's really an interesting question as to whether or not they could obtain this Annex 2 or developing nation status and have these forest products within their territory. The next major step for purposes of our discussion today was development, adoption, and ratification of the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol Phase 1, where people are gearing up to essentially put emissions caps, was from 2005 to 2007. We're currently in Phase 2, 2008 to 2012. You may notice 2012 is right around the corner. So this is why this is very much a hot topic. We need to start thinking and challenging ourselves about what are we going to do in a post-Kyoto world when this protocol sunsets in 2012. The protocol itself set a cap at 5% emissions below 1990 levels. However, the European Union, for example, has done more than that. So it establishes a baseline threshold that countries had to meet. They had to reduce those emissions below that level. But some countries have gone above and beyond that, the European Union being a great example. Now, how is this all relevant for forest management? Well, one of the things that you can do to meet your emissions targets is if for some reason it's difficult for you being a nation state, to meet those 1990 levels or to reduce your emissions levels below the 1990 levels, one of the things you can do is you can enter into a clean development mechanism. You can enter into a project in another country that either somehow is going to capture greenhouse gas emissions or is going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Somehow we're going to be taking greenhouse gas emissions out of the environment. And that's where forest management comes in, because under Kyoto Protocol, there are 2 forest tools, for lack of a better term, that you can use as a clean development mechanism. One are afforestation projects, and the other is reforestation projects. And Dr. Six, again, introduced us into these concepts. But an afforestation project is essentially one that's going to put forests where they previously did not exist. A reforestation project is going to reforest or bring trees back to an area where, perhaps as she was mentioning, there might have been major tree die-offs. So those are already projects that are explicitly recognized under the Clean Development Mechanism, the CDM portion of Kyoto Protocol. So right now under Kyoto Protocol, developed countries can go in and create either afforestation or reforestation projects in developing nations. So that exists. So our question here for us today is, what are we going to do starting in 2012 when Kyoto sunsets? Are we going to continue to have the reforestation and afforestation projects? Are we going to expand that to include deforestation? And if so, how are we going to do that? We started that dialogue in Bali and in Copenhagen. And a lot of the proposals, the legal proposals to begin to address this problem, recognizing that the loss of forest is becoming a huge contributor to greenhouse gases and to climate change, is to discuss the role of deforestation. Because remember, that currently is not included in the scheme of the Kyoto Protocol. So that's where we are today. Should we include legal tools that deal with deforestation? And that's where REDS come into play. So REDS is an acronym for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and parentheses forest degradation. So that's our acronym. And the idea is that we're going to specifically talk about deforestation, because as I mentioned before, deforestation is not included in one of the tools that you can use for a clean development mechanism project under the existing Kyoto Protocol. So there's been a lot of talk about including REDS, about trying to address this problem that Dr. Six did a tremendous job of setting up for us. How can we start to deal with these massive loss of trees and extinctions? So we started this dialogue in Bali and Copenhagen, and we're continuing it today. Essentially what REDS do is they reward developing countries, and again, these are projects that go into developing countries, for reducing deforestation, so doing whatever they can to combat the loss of trees that Dr. Six talked to us about. Now, the Kyoto Protocol did not include tools to address deforestation, only afforestation and reforestation. So this would be a new addition to the Kyoto Protocol. So we currently do not have REDS in the existing version of the treaty. This is something that we need to talk about moving forward post-2012. Many nations have expressed very strong interest in developing REDS, especially coalitions of developing nations. You heard a lot of developing nations coming to the table in Copenhagen and saying, really, we want to develop RED programs in our nations, because these developing nations see this as a win-win. Right? On the one hand, we get to develop these projects that are going to benefit the global world by reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and at the same time, it's a really nice way for developing nations to be able to obtain an economic interest in maintaining their land. So a lot of countries see this as a win-win, and we've seen this as a big push from developing nations to do this. And so it's really something that I think we need to strongly take into consideration as to whether or not REDS have a place in a post-Kyoto treaty. Now, there are some concerns about REDS. One of those concerns are permanence. Is there an ability of the forest to maintain the sequestration of carbon dioxide despite other threats? And again, I think Dr. Six did a great job of establishing for us what are those potential other threats to forests. Many of you probably have far more knowledge and experience than I do, but essentially my understanding is that forests do not maintain a level of carbon dioxide sequestration, that just like everything, they ebb and flow. So therefore, how do we take that into account? Should we include REDS in a post-Kyoto Protocol? How do we take into the account the fact that forests change and their ability to sequester carbon dioxide changes? Another concern associated with REDS is leakage. The idea that the reduction of greenhouse gases in one area may actually lead to increased emissions in another area. So if you're doing deforestation projects in one area of a country, is that therefore going to have the direct corollary effect of having the developing nation increase its carbon dioxide emissions or its greenhouse gas emissions in another portion of the country? Another concern with REDS is additionality. A big concern is that if we do craft this tool, if we do put this tool in a post-Kyoto treaty, that we make sure that we're protecting forests that would otherwise be destroyed. So we don't want to protect, well, we want to protect, but if a forest is already earmarked for protection, so here in the United States we have national forests, national parks, those wild wilderness areas, those areas are already being protected. So that idea would be that they would not fall under REDS because they're already being protected. We want to protect those forests, those areas that would not otherwise be protected. So that's a concern as well. And then the concern that I want to spend a little bit more time talking to you about today is climate justice. How does the development of REDS potentially impact our indigenous communities? Again, I think this is an interesting question for us here in Montana because I see a potential opportunity, a potential legal argument to be made for our federally recognized tribes here to make a claim for developing nation status to do these types of projects under the Clean Development Mechanism. So if we do move forward with that model, if for those of you who recognize tribes, if you're going to make that argument on behalf of your client, and some tribes in the region are already doing that, by the way. The Nez Perce are doing tribal forestry management portfolio greenhouse gas emissions trading on the Chicago Climate Exchange, or have done so in the past. So this isn't a pie-in-the-sky idea here. This is something that our tribal nations are already doing. So if you're going to make that argument, what are the considerations that you or your client or those of you who will be in the fortunate position to draft these legal tools should be taking into consideration? And one of those for me as somebody who looks at the area of the intersection of indigenous rights and environmental law, one of those areas is climate justice. So let's talk a little bit about climate justice. So climate justice is an extension of environmental justice. Environmental justice is a movement that developed here in the United States. It has historical connections to the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Modern environmental justice concerns are really those facing communities of color and poor where they get the inadequate or disproportionate impact of environmental degradation. And so we've seen this move into an international climate justice movement. I see my time's up. Shockingly, as a professor, I've talked too long, so I'm going to go really quickly through these last two slides, and if you have any questions, I'll obviously be here to answer your questions. But this basically shows us why our indigenous communities are different, why they have concerns that other communities may not. It's of course because of our unique connection to the land, our sovereignty, the federal trust relationship, that's an argument for us here in the United States, and then also recently the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People gives indigenous communities around the world rights to self-determination and property interests, which will become important in one moment. And also it's my understanding that this PowerPoint is available to conference attendees, is that correct? For money. Nathan's giving me the money sign. So we're going to go a little bit quickly, but for a low, hopefully well worth your investment fee, you can have this PowerPoint as well. This is the basic legal underpinnings of climate justice in indigenous communities. The important part there is that because of the government-to-government relationships that exist between many of our indigenous communities and the governments where they're located, there's a special legal argument there to be made. A case study, what is this all about? Why are there climate justice concerns? This is an indigenous community in Uganda in the Mount Elgon National Park where a Dutch company went to go do a clean development mechanism forestry management project. The indigenous farmers that were in the Mount Elgon National Park were displaced. They were not allowed to participate in discussions as to how their historic land was going to be used for forestry projects. They were precluded from that discussion, and they lost all their property rights and interest in this land. They were completely displaced. So this is what I'm concerned about. This is the crux of my argument, that as we move forward with REDS, as we look at these legal solutions, we don't want to have people, especially indigenous communities, lose even more rights, lose their property interests, lose their right to self-determination. As you see there, I'm concerned about loss of property rights, loss of right to self-determination, and a lack of a consequence for the polluter. As these developed nations are allowed to move forward with their forestry projects in developing nations, do they have any consequence for their action? That's something we need to be asking ourselves. So therefore, I think we need to keep this in mind as we move forward with developing our legal tools. Thank you very much. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Professor Biber.
Jack first.
Oh, to Jack first.
Thank you very much, Professor Cronk. Welcome back. Eric, the podium is yours.
Thank you very much. Yes. I'm old school. There's no PowerPoint here. I'll stand at a podium. I'm not going to be Jerry Springer. I'll be up here. But hopefully it'll still be interesting. So I want to focus on a similar topic that Professor Cronk is talking about, which is the role that forests might play in offset programs for climate change regulatory systems, and some significant obstacles that those offset programs, I think, are going to face if they want to be successful in the long run. So first, a brief overview of the concept of offsets. The focus of most regulatory proposals for climate change, there's a few places where there's laws now, will be on emissions of carbon into the atmosphere from industrial activities. Think of driving your car or electric power plants. But that leaves a whole lot of human activities that can have significant impacts on the global climate if they're not addressed. As Professor Cronk pointed out, deforestation and forest management could be up to 20% of total carbon emissions on a global basis. Agricultural practices are also a huge issue, such as emissions from livestock or from rice paddies. So these are also areas where there might be relatively low-cost reductions in carbon emissions possible. It might cost a lot less to keep a forest from burning down than it does to retrofit all the coal plants on the planet to capture carbon. Now, it might be hard to directly incorporate forest management activities into a carbon regulatory system, although even if you did, the issues I'm going to talk about still come up. So the general proposal has been to take these into account either through offsets in a cap and trade, a marketable permit system, or through tax credits if you had a carbon tax system. So actions that are beneficial in terms of carbon emissions in agricultural or forest management activities would be rewarded either through direct payments in the tax context through credits or indirect payments through offsets. So here and now, I'm going to focus on the concept of offsets, although again, the same issues would come up even in a tax credit system. So offsets work by allowing a party who's regulated under a cap and trade system, say an electric utility, to purchase an offset that would allow them to emit more carbon dioxide than they otherwise could under their permits. The theory is that the activity that's paid for through the offset would either prevent carbon dioxide from going into the atmosphere that otherwise would have gone up, or it would actively absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So in the forest context, this usually means that forest managers are landowners who manage their forests in a way to either keep carbon from going up into the atmosphere, for instance, by preventing deforestation or degradation of their forests, or actively absorb carbon for the atmosphere, for instance, by reforestation, would get offsets that they could sell to regulated industry and they get money to reward their activities. Now, this is something that's moving already from academic proposals to real proposals. California's new climate change regulatory system already has provisions for offsets for forest activities within the states. And there's proposals to extend that internationally. And Professor Cronk did an excellent job of giving an overview of the proposals at the international level for the RED process, which is basically an offset system as well. There's a lot of issues people have raised with offsets. Professor Cronk has done a wonderful job of laying out problems with leakage, with additionality, with indigenous people's rights, and power issues that relate to where the offsets are implemented. I want to raise 3 more issues that I think are also going to be very, very important. And I want to raise these issues not because I think we shouldn't be doing offsets necessarily, but there's important institutional design issues we're going to need to take into account if we actually want to make offsets work in the long run. Okay? So the first issue I want to raise is the importance of baselines and monitoring. The whole point of offsets in forest management is to make forests work better for carbon management than they would have otherwise. That means you have to have a feel for how the forests are working in response to your management. You have to know, are they in better condition? And in better condition in respect to what? You have to have baseline measurements for how the forests were before the projects got underway. So that means you need ongoing monitoring of the conditions of your forests to determine what their status was before the offset program and what their status during the offset program. The problem is that monitoring is not easy to do. I would refer to Jack Ward-Thomas's. I think he did a very good job of outlining yesterday how hard monitoring can be to do well. It's not easy to do well. Now, there's certainly technologies that have made this easier. We're using a lot more remote sensing techniques from satellites to measure, for instance, the condition of tropical forests or temperate forests. They can tell us a lot about things, but they're not a panacea. They can't measure everything, so not everything can be remotely sensed. You often have to ground truth or double check your remote sensing data with field data. You have to process all that remote sensing data, which is not trivial. And you still have to spend the money to put the satellites and the airplanes up in the air in the first place. So the question is, who's going to do all this measurement? In many cases, it's going to be public agencies, simply because the scale of the resources you're measuring is often much larger than any individual private property scope of any private property ownership. And also, many of the relevant lands are publicly owned. So think of U.S. national forests or the Brazilian Amazon. And also, for reasons I'll get into later, many countries may have political reasons for ensuring that only the state conducts these kinds of surveys. And finally, even if private parties do many of these measurements, public agencies are going to have to double check them to ensure their accuracy. But there are important reasons to doubt that public agencies will necessarily do a good job of monitoring the conditions of forests. So even here in the US, where we have probably one of the best environmental management systems in the world, we have tremendous gaps in the knowledge of the quality and state of our natural environment, including our national forests. And in fact, there may be all sorts of reasons why public agencies might not be aggressive in pursuing effective monitoring of environmental conditions. There might be political pressure not to collect data or not to collect good data. If hundreds of millions of dollars depend on whether you can show that your forests are in a good state, of course there might be a pressure to make sure the data you collect shows that the forests are doing well. Okay? A public agency also might be focused on other goals besides effective forest management. So think of BLM or the Park Service, who have all missions that focus on things besides just maximizing, for instance, timber output or carbon management. They might therefore undervalue the collection of data on forest conditions relating to carbon. Now, all of this is to say why there might be reasons that public agencies don't do a good job of monitoring environmental conditions. That's not to say that they're always bad monitors or even often bad monitors. But it does mean that we need to pay careful attention to how we structure agencies to ensure that they have good incentives to collect effective and informative monitoring data. That might mean, for instance, separating your monitoring functions from other management or regulatory tasks if you think those management or regulatory tasks might get in the way of effective monitoring. So that's one problem. A second problem with offsets is something that a lot of observers have noted already. Managing forests to maximize carbon sequestration or absorption may not be consistent with a lot of other goals we have for our forests. So let me use what might seem like an absurd example, but it is actually one that I think illuminates the problem well. It might well be the case that we could sequester a lot more carbon if we clear-cut the entire Amazon forest, dumped all the logs at the bottom of the ocean so they don't decay, and planted it completely with fast-growing eucalyptus trees. That would probably absorb a lot more carbon out of the atmosphere. Now, it would have a small impact on global biodiversity, right? That's going to have an impact. Now, that's an extreme example, and that's probably not going to happen, cross our fingers. And I don't think it's a trade-off anyone in this room would make. Right now, we'll see if climate change keeps getting worse. But that kind of trade-off is frequently present in making these kinds of management decisions about what kinds of projects should receive offset funding and which should not. Moreover, we're going to have to make those decisions in conditions of tremendous uncertainty. We're not going to be able to easily predict how particular management decisions affect biodiversity or not. Again, this was a point Jack Ward-Thomas made in a very strong way yesterday morning. It's very hard for us to understand how we can achieve biodiversity outcomes when we make management choices. So that makes writing rules up front, ex-ante rules, about how much or how little we want to protect biodiversity very difficult. It's all very well and good to say, for instance, as the U.S. Endangered Species Act says, don't manage in a way that will push a species over the edge into extinction. But how do you know whether your actions are actually going to result in the extinction of a species? Anyone who's done any work in the ESA knows that that is the source of many fruitful lawsuits and scientific disputes and political disputes. Well, given that uncertainty, deciding who does the analysis of how projects will affect other resources besides carbon is a big deal. The people who do the analysis will get to choose the assumptions and inferences that you necessarily need to transfer our limited data about the world around us into management conclusions. The people who often collect and analyze the relevant information are going to be scientists, agency scientists, and other scientists. But an important thing to keep in mind about scientists is that they're a very diverse group. They have very different perspectives. Forest scientists are not conservation biologists, are not hydrologists. And different perspectives shape the information they produce. Now, I'm not saying there's no truth out there, that I'm embracing some sort of radical relativism. I'm just saying that in environmental issues and environmental science, where we have necessarily limited data in a complex and dynamic world, you're going to have to use a lot of assumptions and inferences to turn that data into useful information. And the perspectives of the scientists who apply and develop those assumptions and inferences will matter a great deal. So here's the policy takeaway from this point for offsets. If you're concerned that offsets might affect another goal, just say, for example, biodiversity protection, and you know that information is limited, one useful way of ensuring that other goal is met is by putting scientists who care about that goal very much in charge of doing your analysis. So if you care a lot about biodiversity, maybe you want to put conservation biologists, who by definition care a lot about biodiversity, in charge of assessing the impacts of proposed offset projects in biodiversity. They're likely to reach conclusions based on uncertain data that will protect endangered species and ecosystems and reduce that risk. Now, that may not be your policy goal. You may think they're overprotective, but it's at least a policy option that you think you're going to have to consider in setting these programs up. The third and final problem I want to highlight is more long-term, but perhaps the most important. And it has to do with how countries see natural resources in general and forests in particular. Now, there's a long, long tradition of countries seeing natural resources as very intimately tied up with their sovereignty. So if you've ever traveled in Brazil, I've done it once, it's wonderful, but you'll see graffiti on the streets, and I'm quite serious, graffiti on the streets in random Brazilian cities saying, "The Amazon is ours." Why? Because there's a long, long historical concern that outsiders want to come in and take the Amazon away from Brazil. And that's reflected in different historical contexts against different threats. The current one is that the international community is going to come in and internationalize the Amazon to protect it as an environmental resource, okay? This is common throughout the world in forest law, and reflected in the resources of forests being called national patrimony. So Peru has that, and other countries as well. And this is not just a legacy of colonialism in the developing world. We call them national forests here in the US for a reason. They were seen as too important for private parties to control and manage on their own. Whether you agree with that decision or not, normatively, descriptively, it's true. That was the rhetoric in the 19th century that justified the creation of the national forest system. So what does this mean for offsets? So at least international offsets are going to require transactions across national borders. Now, the kinds of management practices that we're talking about for something like REDD are not simply limited to don't cut your trees down or don't let the forest burn. In part because a large amount of the benefits in carbon sequestration and absorption come from not just keeping the forest there, but managing it in certain ways, managing it to retain certain species and certain functions in the ecosystems. So that means there's going to be, the process of controlling forest management is a lot more complicated and intrusive than you might otherwise think. All sorts of management choices might be important for carbon retention and absorption. And as I noted earlier, information about forest management is not easy to obtain, right? Monitoring is difficult. So it won't always be possible to monitor whether you're achieving these complicated management goals. So what you might do instead is use proxies, and one proxy might be, well, as long as the management system is good, as long as it's not corrupt, as long as it's enforced, we might have confidence that it's achieving the outcomes it promises, okay? And you can also directly want changes in governance because of things like concerns about indigenous rights, other goals as well. However, if offsets are a big business, and what we're proposing is to make it a big business, otherwise it's not going to matter, right? It seems unlikely we're going to want to take countries' their word for it that everything is okay, we're managing our forests fine. If nothing else, there's going to be competition in the offset market. Brazil and the Democratic Republic of Congo and Peru and Papua New Guinea and Costa Rica are all going to be out there selling their offsets. And the sellers of high-quality offsets won't want to be undercut by the sellers of low-quality offsets. So there's going to be demands for audits and confirmation that management is happening. But what's going to be the reaction of, say, Brazil or Peru or perhaps even the US if we have domestic offset systems, if outsiders start demanding investigations of forest management practices and perhaps even outside supervision and reformation of those forest management practices because of concerns about the quality of the offsets? You might think there could be a political backlash. And again, to give an example of this, in the Western US in the 1990s when there was a tremendous uproar about outside environmental groups coming in and telling us locals how to manage our public lands. You heard stories about black helicopters in the UN coming in to take over and internationalize US public land management, okay? Now, again, that might have been totally implausible, but that conspiracy story, I think, reflects, you see the parallels in Brazil, the sensitivity, the political sensitivity of outsiders telling you how to manage your forests. So if you don't think about this risk now, it's going to come back and, I think, bite you in 20 or 30 years when these offset programs happen. I don't know any easy solutions to this last problem. Perhaps, as I said, independent monitoring programs might mean you have more trust in the information that's produced, so there's less need to audit. Perhaps people will see forests differently in 20 or 30 years as less closely tied to their country and their place. I'm skeptical of that as well. So I'll leave you the last problem I don't have a good answer to, but those are three problems we definitely need to think about as we move towards offsets.
And our last panelist, and certainly not our least, is Professor Owley from Buffalo, and she is going to give us a perspective on private lands conservation and climate change.
Yes, I know I'm the odd woman out here. I'm from the East, and I'm talking about private lands at a public land conference in Montana. Bear with me. I also want to follow in Elizabeth's footsteps, although not literally. I'm a little too clumsy than that, and thank the students. It's been a really, my first time in Montana. It's exciting. And it's been a really nice opportunity and prodding to get me to return to an area that is where I actually first began my graduate work. I have a master's of science in forest science, but as many law students do, once I went to law school, fell in love with property, and have really continued my career from there. So this was a really nice place for me to bring the two together, and you'll see why this is very much both a forest talk and a property talk. As Jack said, I'm going to be talking a little bit, or mostly about private lands here, but really in a public lands context. I'm going to be talking about the Forest Legacy Program. Are there any of you in the room that work with the Forest Legacy Program? A couple. Okay, good. Awesome. You will be the people I will hunt down afterwards.
In a nice way.
In a very nice way. Yes. No. So, Forest Legacy Program. Oh, wait. I'm sorry. I'm pressing the wrong buttons here. Oh, you did it for me. You're magical. Okay, so the Forest Legacy Program, I know a few of you in the room are quite familiar with it, but for those of you who are not, this came out of the 1990 Farm Bill. And it is a U.S. Forest Service program. So it is a program coming out of the Forest Service, but it is working with private landowners and states in a more cooperative approach, with the acknowledgement that many of our forests are no longer on, are not, or never were, simply on our public lands. This ties really well into the talk, if any of you guys were here yesterday, about some of the collaborative projects that are going on. This recognition that for all of the problems, and of course this is the climate change talk, so we'll get there too, all the problems that the earlier panelists have talked about, we can't solve them solely by looking at our public lands, and that we have to, for many of our forest programs, look at private lands. In name, this is a program that deals with fee simple acquisition of forests and conservation easements. The fee simple acquisition is almost non-existent in this program, and of course I'm hoping those of you in the room who know better will correct me if that's true afterwards. This is really a conservation easement driven program. So this is what I'm going to delve into a little bit deeper in this talk today, is how these conservation easements work, how they work in the context of climate change, and whether or not they're always a good idea. So 1996 amendments here are very important, especially for places here like Montana, because in 1996 is where they changed the Forest Legacy Program to really increase the role that states play and give the states the ability to run these programs. From 1990 to 1996, all of these programs were really run out of the Forest Service with state cooperation, but the Forest Service is the one holding the conservation easements or holding the fee simple land. Once they changed it in 96 and gave states a bigger role, a lot more states became involved. So I think now we have, I think it's 49 states. Almost all the states are enrolled in the Forest Legacy Program, even if they do not yet have any Forest Legacy projects. Everyone has kind of raised their hand and said, me too, we want to do it. Keep doing this, I'm pressing the wrong thing. Okay, so just the program goals here, I think these are nice to keep in mind as we're thinking about what the point of the Forest Legacy Program is. Because we see that we're talking about a few things, right? That we're talking about forest areas that are threatened to conversion to non-forest uses. And we see there's other language within the goals, but that's really the chief one. Where this came out of was a study in the Northeast. Maine, New York, New Hampshire, Vermont, looking at those forests and the high level of conversion to non-forest uses, and how could we slow that program. And we can slow that program, of course, that progress by paying forest owners to keep their land in forests. That's the main thrust of this program. Now, along with that, they of course add language that we're talking about, and if you look at the third point here, also protecting. One of these is a pointer, maybe? Nope. Whoa. I have no idea what I did. Yes, anyways, well. if you were to have been able to see the third point there, I just wanted to point out that they also include this idea that it's important to protect the cultural, fish, wildlife, recreational forests. This is actually one of the first times we see this in the Farm Bill, this idea that we're not just protecting forests for growing forests, but there are recreational aspects. Recreation, I think this is one of the first places we see recreation mentioned in that long list of something we're doing on private forest lands, right? Obviously we know multiple use, a lot of us use our public forests that way. Let's try this again. Okay. Very briefly, the mechanisms, especially for the students in the room, how this thing works. So I actually think of this as being one of the more simple federal laws. Other people think it sounds complex, but within the category of federal land management, this isn't too bad. So each state puts together an assessment of need where they look at their own state's conditions of their forests. They designate what they feel are their important areas. So you designate a whole region. So in New York, for example, we would designate the Adirondacks as being an important forestry region. And within that region, then we set forth criteria of what types of projects we would want to protect, what types of parcels are we looking for? What are some of the aspects of this property we want? And so we get some guidance here from the Forest Service of telling us what types of things they want the states to look at, but the states actually put this together in conjunction a little bit with the Forest Service, but the first round always being done by the state. The Forest Service has to approve it, and it does get periodically reviewed, although that 5-year timeline doesn't seem to be really binding most people. And then the project selection. So this is kind of an interesting program in the way that we set up regions, and then we set up ideas for what types of projects we want in those regions. But we haven't actually at that point approved those projects. We still need individual landowners to come forward and ask to be part of the project, or maybe we'll go out and solicit them to become part of the project. And then we still don't have the money actually at that point, so we have to go and get the money. So there's a little bit of a change, and depending on how the state runs it, whether all the money goes to the state first or goes to the individuals. And the essence of those details don't matter as much as the fact that we're talking about a state process of putting together what the state thinks is important. We're talking about individual landowners who are voluntarily coming forward and participating in this project. Oh, and so I wanted to show this map because we saw a lot of maps yesterday of the forest land. We kept seeing, I think we saw the same map quite a few times of where all the forest, public forest lands and public lands are in the United States. And so here's a map where it's a slightly different story for once, which is, and I'm afraid to try and figure out where the pointer is on here. So if we look, yes, thank you. What I really want to point out are these kind of red dots. I'm sure you can't see too well in the back, but you should be able to see the pattern of them clustered in the east, right? So a very different story than the public lands. Oh, thank you, Eric, so handy. Right, so you know, we were hearing these stories yesterday about public lands. I come from a state, I now work in a state where 0.9% is federal land, right? There's a very different story. Our forest management stories are issues with which statutes we're thinking about are just not the same. I think we have one national forest in New York. So, you know, we're not talking about the same framework. But when we get to these types of programs, we see here is where now we have a lot of red clustered over there, a lot of these projects. And it started, and that's why it started in the Northeast as well. That was the area where we see need. Now, Montana's not left out. You do see there are some projects there in Montana. I wish I had a good Montana close-up map to show you of where the projects are. And this map is a little bit old, so there's a couple states that aren't included. But now I think we have every state except for, except for North Dakota. I think they just decided they don't want to do it yet. All right, let's see. Okay, so as I promised, I'm getting to climate change. All right, so the conservation easements. Wait, let me see if I have, yeah, here's just a map showing you kind of on a state level what these tend to look like. And like I said, I wish I had a pretty map like this for Montana, but we see that each colored area represents one of these regions that's designated. And then within there, we have the individual kind of bullet balloons coming out are the individual projects. So we're not actually talking at a huge number of projects across the country. Considering that New York was one of the very first states to start using forest legacy projects, and this is how many have been designated, and not all of those are yet been funded or put in place. We're actually talking about, at this point, very few projects. Okay, so the conservation easements. So these are used by conservation easements, non-possessory interest in land, where we're making a deal with the landowner that they will refrain from doing something on their land that they would otherwise be able to do, and we're going to give them something in exchange. Under the Forest Legacy Program, what we do is we give them money. And that money, 75% comes from the Forest Service. Another 25% they have to come from somewhere else, from the state, from a land trust. Actually, quite often the landowners donate that remaining 25% to get a tax deduction. So I have elsewhere written, I'm happy to share with you if you are intrigued or not, about the general climate change concerns we might have of using conservation easements as a tool. Conservation easements are perpetual under the Forest Legacy Program. And there's a lot of kind of hesitation we might have about creating any perpetual restriction on the land in a landscape that we know is rapidly changing, as we've heard earlier. Even slowly changing, right? They're perpetual. So there's a lot of kind of general concerns we might have of both them lasting too long, perhaps hampering changes we might want to make to the land. We've heard a lot about kind of adaptive management. Some of them it's quite hard to write adaptive management into conservation easements. Sometimes we might worry that they don't actually last long enough, just to be two-sided about this. So sometimes there's we might be worried that change conditions, especially in states that allow for the doctrine of change conditions, would enable a landowner to remove the conservation easement on their land. If they could show that climate change meant that it looked so different from the baseline that it was no longer the same type of property, there might be legal ways that they could get rid of these restrictions on their land, thereby also defeating our goals with the Forest Legacy Program. And just the last point is that they do complicate adaptive management, and I don't want to say it's impossible in any way. There are people who are writing them in because they have to have forest plans. It's actually part of it. But we've heard a lot about monitoring. The monitoring requirements are often minimal on some of these, and they're struggling to make them better. I think they are improving. Now, those are kind of general climate change concerns we might have with conservation easements, and I could speak on that for hours. I just want to point out that in specific working forest conservation easements, we have added concerns that tie into those. You know, for example, most conservation easements have very strong language about invasive species, prohibiting any planting of invasive species with very little definition of what we might mean by that. There's some foresters who worry that a change in species might be exactly what we need to bring to a piece of property as the landscape changes. Also, usually very strong language prohibiting any earth movement or water course alteration. And we can see quite quickly why with climate change those might be the very things that we feel are best for managing the forest or managing the biodiversity or other uses on the land. Also, many forest legacy programs require public access to those lands, which is something that some private landowners are quite nervous about. Yes, thank you. So the last thing I'll touch on, and this is kind of a very unimpressive slide, but it does relate to the CLE materials that some of you may or may not have, or I'm happy to provide copies of what I put together. These are where I actually am studying the conservation easements. So as I said, there's not that many Forest Legacy Program projects yet. I have 12 that are part of my study that come out of a larger conservation easement study that I'm working on, and in 3 different states, trying to get a variety of different landscapes and different frameworks. So I'm looking at South Carolina, New York, and Wisconsin. And one of the first things we notice of looking at these conservation easements is that there's absolutely no consistency across them. Even though they're all coming out of the same program, the Forest Service is providing guidance. There's no consistency in the terms of them. There's no consistency in who's holding them. The Forest Service is usually not mentioned at all as being able to enforce them in any way, even though under the statute and under the guidance it appears that they're trying to retain the rights to enforce them. It often looks like they're donated, even though we know that they're getting a bunch of money from the federal government. Now, all of these things, whether we think these are concerns, I guess is up for debate. Let me just, so whether or not we think it's a bad thing that the Forest Service isn't mentioned, or it's a bad thing that they don't have enforcement, and I do, that's why I mentioned, I think we put a lot of public energy, we put a lot of public money into these, we want to make sure that the Forest Service and the states are retaining some ability to come in if something goes wrong, but a lot of these are held by private land trusts, and that is kind of left out of the document. And it's not clear to me what happens in 15 years if we have a problem and that land trust doesn't have the capacity or the interest in enforcing. Okay, and then the last point, just to build off of some of the things people said a little bit earlier about the offsets and the carbon credits. This is a new thing that we're seeing popping up in some of these. I only have one that I've seen it so far, but in one of the Wisconsin Forest Legacy projects, the Nature Conservancy was very clear that they're getting all the carbon rights, whatever they might be one day if we were to happen to be able to figure out how to do it and what market they might go on. So there are these hypothetical carbon rights that we might get. Now, of course, these bring up the problems of additionality and that we heard earlier, but it is something that is hard to calculate, hard to figure out what to do with. And in the beginning, the Forest Service kind of just ignored that it was an issue. They didn't mention it. They kept it out of the guidance. They didn't put it in the conservation easements. And I've talked to a few people at the Forest Service who are now saying, oh, maybe we should think about that and think about who gets them, and maybe we should try and hold on to it some way. So we see there's a lot of kind of climate change issues in this Forest Legacy project program that we should still be kind of thinking about how to work out. Thank you.
I think we're going to move straight into questions from the audience, given that we've run a little bit over with the panel time. So do we have an interest in asking these panelists questions from the audience? Do we have a microphone? And while you're taking it back, I would like to start with a question. If I heard Professor Six state that ecosystem restoration projects in the Northern Rockies are sort of pointless at this point. My understanding is the Forest Service is doing almost nothing but ecosystem restoration projects. How do you square that?
Well, it also depends on how people are defining restoration. Okay, a lot of things, that is a term that has become more and more misused and adapted to how people want to do things. True restoration is when you move some degraded or changed ecosystem back to perhaps what it was before. Okay, so to a historical point, so restore, restoration. And so with a lot of our forests, you saw a lot of effects of fire suppression, a lot denser forests, different compositions. So one of the classic examples of restoration is opening those stands back up to ponderosa pine forest, for example, that, what they used to be like and could handle fire better. True restoration treatments that do take forests back to a historical perspective or condition probably aren't the best approaches these days. But there is a lot of things that are being done that are called restoration that are actually a little more than that they're recognizing there's some difference. Unfortunately, a lot of the stuff that does hit the ground now still is done in the context of true restoration. It is going back to historical states, or what a lot of us are starting to call resistance, trying to build in resistance against particular perturbations such as bark beetle outbreaks, fire, things like that. Neither of those are going to be very useful as climate continues to change, because it really does try to hold a forest ecosystem in a static particular condition, and in many cases by trying to force it to remain the same, we're really just setting it up for catastrophic failure. So
Can I follow up on that, Jack? Because I think a takeaway from Professor Six's presentation is a question. There was an implicit premise through many of the discussions yesterday that we need to do large-scale restoration work on the national forests to deal with climate change, and litigation in NEPA is getting in the way of that. And I think Professor Six's presentation really questions that underlying premise. And that may or may, there's debate about that, but I think what it shows is a lot of that debate about why we need to cut back in litigation in NEPA so we can do these restoration projects is consciously are not using science to justify what people really want to do, which is maybe cut trees to get more jobs, that's fine. Or maybe we just need psychologically to feel like we can do something about climate change as everything changes around us, and that makes us feel better, even if it doesn't make the ecosystem better, whatever that might mean. That's fine as well. But then, again, to paraphrase Jack Ward Thomas, probably not in the way he would want, but he said yesterday, well, screw this biodiversity protection, just tell us you want to keep out of the forest. My response is, don't really rely so much on these restoration arguments, just tell us you want jobs or you want to feel better about yourself by cutting some trees.
Question in the back?
Professor Biber, I have a question about the political pressures that you suggested might emerge when charging the agencies with collecting data. And as you know, I'm sure the Forest Service has the largest, I believe, scientific forestry research organization in the world, in the FIA. I was wondering whether you had seen any of that bias in FIA data that you've examined.
I can't speak to the modern history of the Forest Service, and I'm going to talk about a historic example that's enlightening, but modern history of the Forest Service, trying to go through all that data to figure out if it's good or not would be a Herculean task. I think there's the vast majority of Forest Service scientists are wonderful and do great work. The Forest Service, I think, generally, I want to emphasize, I'm not implying bad intent here. I think most of this is subconscious, right? It's pressures about structuring the world you're in and what you think is possible or not possible. But to give an example of something that's a lot more obvious, there's a wonderful book by a former Forest Service research person named Ashley Schiff. His book is Fire and Ice. And it's about the history of forest research in the Forest Service when the research system was first set up in the 20s, going through the 1950s. And he very well documents how the Forest Service basically told its research staff, get us good evidence why fire is bad for forests, because we want to stop fire. Right? Even though there was tons, people talk about, we've discovered that forest fires are bad, or forest suppression, fire suppression is bad for ponderosa. People were thinking about this like this in the 19-teens and 20s, but it wasn't politically, palatable because the Forest Service felt that they, as a management matter, needed to get a handle on fire management, particularly preventing private landowners in places like the South from using fire as a management technique, which they'd done for decades. So they didn't want scientific information out there that made that political argument more difficult, right? So that's an example of that. And again, a lot of this wasn't bad intent. The science was uncertain, so they just sort of nudged scientists, well, hey, if this seems to question fire suppression, well, do some more research. Make sure you're right about that. Whereas if it seemed to indicate that fire suppression was good, they got that out as quickly as they could, right? And again, none of this is bad intent. It's a lot of this is sort of psychologically natural for us. We grasp the information that backs up what we think we need to do or want to do, and we're more skeptical of the information that doesn't. So a lot of this is subtle.
So I work with Forest Service. And, not that there are a lot of people who have associations with the Forest Service here. And this has been an excellent panel, all the way across. Excellent panel, yeah, for sure. One of the things that came up for me with the discussion, and I'm on the next panel, so I'll talk more about this a little bit later, is this place where we're at. We just kind of got to this point where this idea of ensuring ecological function, whether we call it restoration, this word resiliency, is one that we spend a lot of time talking about now, in the path, and then when you measure that against the scale and the nature of change that's going to keep occurring on these landscapes. I had a question for Dr. Six, and then a follow-up one for Eric. And Dr. Six, I was wondering, especially being familiar with the Northwest, last year we celebrated the 100-year anniversary of the 1910 fires, and we also commemorated the legacy that came with that, especially around the management of lands, in an early era where protecting that timber resource was really paramount. Here we are now, looking back over those 100 years, which we've done quite a bit, and really need to reconcile the impact or effect of fire suppression with the conditions that we have now. As one, management action that occurred across the West, public lands, private lands, et cetera. I was wondering what your thoughts are when you look at the die-offs that we're experiencing. What would be different, if our fire suppression choices had not been as absolute as they were in the past, is my first question. And then just kind of following up with Eric, the Forest Service does have probably more data than anyone. It's a question of how that data gets used and interpreted is where that kind of nexus of, the views of the day and the needs of the day that come in. What we found is that we're able to go back to data that we collected all across the country, north, south, east, and west, starting 100 years ago, and be able to reinterpret that in the context of what we've seen by way of climate and such. And I was just wondering if you could share your views on that a little bit. So,
okay. Okay, so what would be different if we didn't suppress fire? Oof. That one I haven't gotten before. Well, I think that in many cases we would have, and I'm not a fire person, and Ron's probably going to be cringing back there in my answers, but I would expect that we'd have more natural fire patterns, but that they would still be exacerbated because we have hotter, drier conditions. And so we'd still have an increase in problems with fire. As far as insects, I think that in some cases we would have, I'm not sure how much impact it would have on bark beetles, because so much of what is happening now is driven by temperature rather than just stand conditions. Stand conditions are certainly important. Perhaps some of the homogeneity that has resulted across the landscape has exacerbated it to a bit, but it certainly wouldn't have stopped the geographic range expansions, the movements up into whitebark pine, any of that stuff. So we'd still have greater problems. Okay. One thing I do want to throw in just a little bit about the monitoring. That is one of the things that that is going to be so necessary, and it is difficult, and I think it's important that we do have the right people doing it. Quite often with bark beetles, the monitoring, if anything at all happens, is being done by people that don't really know anything about bark beetles. So it's being the designs, the people who conduct it. There's not a lot of basic knowledge behind the development of the data that's collected when it is, and it's pretty rare. Usually the treatments are put in, this is to control beetles, beetle-proof stands, which doesn't work, that's not true, and then people walk away. And then they just assume those treatments work, they continue them forever, and when they fail, there's no publication of those results. I've seen thin stand after thin stand fail over the last few years, where you have stands that aren't thinned right next door that are fine. They cut them all down, nothing's said, thinning still works. So, I mean, it needs to be appropriate, it needs to be done by the right people, whether it's somebody outside the agency or in, or a combination.
So Professor Six did a great job of making the point I was going to make in response to your question, which is they have a lot of data, but they don't have the right kind of data. And one of the reasons you don't always have, now, a lot of the data is the right kind of data. I don't want to overstate. I'm not saying everything's terrible. But I'm saying that's a great example of people went out and collected a lot of good data, but it wasn't the right kind of data because there really wasn't the incentive for people to focus on how to get it right. Because getting it right might have been problematic, right? And it also relates, even if you have a lot of good data, doing the analysis on it requires time and energy and focus, right? And again, if that's going to be problematic, why would you put a person year worth of time to digging through the database when what that's going to do is give you information that might not actually get you where the political appointees or whoever think we need to go.
We have time for...
Your hand up? Well, actually, it's too long a question, but I mean, more food for thought. It was an interesting intersection. I was going to ask for comment from the panel in terms of these issues of environmental justice. On the one hand, versus the, in essence, monetization through the offset permit holder, vesting of rights,
and how that relates to the concept, for instance, of the atmospheric trust and broader issues of who owns the atmosphere.
Come back next year.
I think you've raised a really interesting question that is, especially timely in light of the current global economic situation that we find ourselves in. As we commodify and we talk about these things in economic terms, and as we face ourselves in increasing pressures, both scientific and on the environment, economic, global repercussions, how is that going to impact human rights? I mean, so it's a constant cost-benefit analysis, and I think the question that you're talking about is something we could debate and we could spend the rest of the morning talking about. You raise a really good, interesting question that we all need to deal with effectively.
All right. Well, with that, our time is up. A round of applause for this excellent panel, and thank you all for your participation.
Thank you.